Usually in the YouTube situation, there's one person in charge because it's their channel.
Yeah.
And so it's like, we kind of know who's in charge of what. Yeah, there's always this, at least implicit.
Well, go ahead. No. Well, okay. You see, we're from Canada.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So there was a question I mentioned to you and Paul, and perhaps we can start there. But we don't have to stay there. We won't stay there.
Yeah.
So I picked up on your theme of sacrifice, letting go, a kind of death, as being very, very central to coming into right relationship with reality. Is that a fair thesis to at least one part?
Yeah.
Good. And then I took it and I took it into a particular state of orientation. Because if you maintain the orientation you have towards all the beings or all the creatures, if you want to use more biblical language, right? That's not the right stance to be in relationship with being or the grounded being, ultimate reality, whatever, God, if that's fair enough, I think. And you can't use a thing to come into right relationship with no thingness. And I thought that thesis was reasonably derivable from your thesis. And I think you find, I'm not claiming their equivalence because I don't want to step on doctrinal toes, but there's significant similarities between theosis and other states like that in other traditions. And you've acknowledged that in the past, so I don't think that's a point where we get stuck or anything. But then it came to me that point is in tension, and I hope it's tonos and not just tension, with something we were also apparently all agreeing on, which is the need for a significant revival, reinventio of ritual and symbol. And yet ritual and symbol seem to bind us to creatures, to things, to particulars. And then there seems to be a tremendous tension, at least initially. Is that fair?
Oh, no, I think it's fair. I think that, let me toss something in so we can kind of have a few things going. One of the things that I was thinking about yesterday when we were thinking about the question of the origin, the past and the future, and the notion of how we exist between the two.
Yes.
And I started realizing, because St. Maximus talks about the logos as both the origin and the telos, right? The alpha and the omega, right? The beginning and the end. And I started to realize that, let's say, if you think about that image you have of the campfire, and they go out.
Yeah.
When they leave the campfire, they're both remembering the past and the future.
Yes.
Right. So the idea that you can remember the future is very important, because you do that every time you're doing any task. Right. If you're building something, you're remembering the future. You're always remembering what the telos is, but that telos is the reason why you're doing the thing in the first place. And so and the reason why I bring that up is, of course, it reflects on the choices that I made in trying to reawaken a kind of, let's say, a more integrated vision of the world, is that I don't think we can reinvent. Like, I really don't think we can reinvent. In some ways, our origin is given to us. Right? It comes, like I mentioned that yesterday, it comes down from heaven. That sounds like a weird thing to say, but we're given an origin. There are moments that people participate in origin moments, but you can't. It's a Kairos, right? You can't make that up. You know, you kind of, things just happen to be in this right place at the right time with the right people, and then it's almost as you're doing it, you realize that now there's an origin of something happening. And so because of that, I tend to go back to, this is something that my brother developed, by the way. If everybody probably knows about him, but I want to acknowledge that this idea came from him. He uses the trope of promised land and exile as a structure to understand the bigger meaning crisis. That there seems to be in the Bible a structure which is the place where you find your home, your identity, and communion, and then a place where that breaks, and all of a sudden things don't make sense. You're in the land of the foreigner. It's foreign gods. You can't have cohesion. And what he does is he applies that to the whole problem. So the scientific development, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, scientism, and that thinking is in some ways it's a moment of exile. Mm-hmm. But so it's part of the bigger patterns. Like in some ways, I don't think it's not something that hasn't happened before. Although our version is accelerated. But I see in history moments when this breakdown and exile happens, and it seems like there are certain things that you can do when you're in that moment. Repent, remember, like Jonah, right at the bottom of the waters. It's like, remember the holy place, turn, reorient yourself towards the origin, which also becomes the telos. And so I think that explains a little bit why, and when I look at how Christians did it, when the world changed from the Roman Empire, let's say, to the Christian world, it wasn't as much a break as some people want to represent it. Because you can see in Dante, the greatest example of that, in the way that Dante formulated his cosmic image, he integrated all the Roman myths with the Christian story into a kind of synthesis.
That was good. Okay, so first of all, on the initial point, I don't use the word invent or reinvent. I use inventio, which is a Latin word which means simultaneously to make and to discover.
Okay.
So it's a verb of active participation, not of making.
Yeah.
It's right. And so reinventio is to turn back to the inventio place. And that's what I meant earlier when I was talking about dialectic into dialogos. There's practices you can do, but you can't make dialogos.
Yeah.
It's not an artifact, right? You can do things, just like a fire, you can make all the conditions that increase the chances it will catch, but it has to catch of its own accord. So I'm in complete agreement, I think, with the first point. That's why I'm very careful to use that word rather than the English word invent, because invent, especially in America, invent means this.
Wait, we have this idea of innovation.
Yes.
It's like our God, this idea of innovation.
No, for me, and that's why I use more often the metaphor of befriending. You can't make somebody your friend, but it's not like you're passive though. Like you have to set yourself, you have to orient yourself, you have to make yourself available, and then there's a possibility that friendship will spark. So first of all, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about there. Second, I think very much the understanding this as a Kairos is right, and this is the next point is something I've independently worked on, but D.C. Schindler also talks a lot about in the Critique of Pure Reason, is the idea of synoptic integration. The idea is, and this is also counter-current in a big way. Believe me, I know this, because we've had these two channels in the West, and they're superimposed on each other, which is bureaucratization and specialization. And like I mentioned last time, it's a significant problem in psychology. Like, do you think that people who did work on meaning in life and belonging
would talk to each other?
Would talk to each other, and they don't, right? And so I think a way in which we're gathering the logs so that the fire can spark is, and this is what I do in cognitive science, and what I'm trying to do even more broadly, trying to integrate with your work and a very respectful in Philia, right, and with David Schindler's work and Paul, and right, is to achieve that state of the broadest possible synoptic integration that can make available, I think, what you're talking about. So yes, the Christians didn't just, right? And that's what I also try and get with the word steal the culture, as opposed to like make a revolution, right? Like what you're doing is you're taking the Logos' ability to gather things together so they belong together, so that you can give an account and to which you are accountable, all that stuff. And I see that as a project of, like, it's simultaneously the Logos is spinning, trying to get it to spin out more and more, and also try and more coalesce together in an integration. That's very much the project.
So there's a way in which, in the moment of exile actually has an advantage. It's hard to understand it, but if you look at the stories in Scripture, exile is the place where you get riches. Exile is the place where your body grows. It's the
Riches?
Yeah.
I thought you said witches.
No.
That was weird.
No, you don't. Maybe you can. Maybe you gather a few of those too. But it's mostly the place where you get riches. And so that's the place where you increase your body. Is the place to think about it. And you can think about it very simply, right? When your very coherent worldview starts to shatter, things start to grow too much, and then they disconnect from the origin. But that also adds possibility.
Yes.
If you're ever capable of reconnecting them, then all of a sudden your capacity is so much more, because more is now connected to the top.
Yeah, I think of Kairos as remember how at the level of attention and then at the level of the distributed cognition, you have the dispersal and variation, and then you have the selective return to the coalescing center.
Yeah.
Your brain is doing that, culture's doing that. And I think in Kairos, what you're just describing is exactly that. You go into the wilderness, you break the frame, so variation is now possible, and then that new variation gets drawn back in to something. And it's the T.S. Eliot poem. We return to the center after all of our journeying, and we know it again for the first time. There's a sense of sati, you remember it and you refit, but you also, it's like when people say, it's the anamnesis, when people are in when Dialogos catches and people say, I've always been looking for this, but I didn't know what I was looking for. It's the memory that's also a discovery. That's why, for me, that's what I'm trying to get with that word inventio. Yeah. It's like, oh, I was always looking for this, but I didn't know, kind of thing.
And I think what's important, at least for me, because I always complain about the modern world, everybody knows, but there's a way in which, because one of the problems we have is always there's a line of thinking, there's a philosophical line which tends to see, all manifestation or variation as a kind of decomposition. The idea that it's immediately evil because as soon as it moves into variety, that whole kind of Gnostic strain. But if you understand that the moving out into exile actually has a function to then recapture or bring in more into the pattern, then all of a sudden the pattern of exile and the idea of kind of breaking home, right, or losing of domicile even, can, if reoriented, capture more of the world.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. Right. And so that this the sort of maximal possible frame breaking for the maximal frame making, like in a systemic insight. Sometimes you have an insight into a problem, and then you have an insight into a set of problems, like your relationship hasn't been going right, and it's not like, well, how do I do the 9-dot problem? It's like, oh, wait, all of these problems have this nexus, and if I address this nexus, they all, a systemic insight, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there's that breaking and making. But the point I want to get at, to bring it back to the original point, is what is the most appropriate stance to maximal frame breaking that will allow for the metanoia return to the center? And that's what I was proposing, this stance of the most original orientation we have, which is this stance towards, because this is the stance that keeps all the possibilities available, but they're not disoriented, right? And that's what I was trying to get to, this place, what I was talking about, that I see at least shared in theosis and nirvana and Tao, right? This place where, right, you've let go of trying to hold on to, because as long as you're thinking in a thingy fashion, you're holding on to the framing that bounds and makes them those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And if you really are prepared, you really want to let go of the framing, right? You have to let go of that way of thinking. You have to get to this original orientation state in order to be at the appropriate place on the horizon, right? So that you can be open to what you're talking about, the new possibilities, without giving up being oriented. Because if you give up being oriented, then you're screwed, because then you're just tumbling through the nothingness, right? Does that make sense?
No, I think that's exactly what I think. The image that I have in Exodus, seems to be what's happening. When Israel leaves Egypt, right? breaking, every
Yeah,
frame breaking.
yeah.
And they also leave with a bunch of other people. Like everybody thinks like Israel left Egypt. No, it says it was a mixed multitude. It was just a bunch of people, Israelites, all kinds of other people, riffraff, who knows. It was like this massive, unformed thing that goes out into the desert, right? That goes through the waters, that dies, that loses its previous identity. And then there's a process of covenant and of receiving law from above and a reestablishing of hierarchy, which binds everything together. Some of it has a communion aspect to it. Some of it has also a kind of cutting off the dead wood aspect of it, which is the harsher part. But you can kind of understand that. I mean, the reason why I'm talking about this so much is that I do have hope ultimately, because I sometimes express a lot of hopelessness. But I really do have hope that this story of even the meaning crisis and the breakdown and everything is necessarily leading to a higher participation and to a bigger frame. It's just that while it's happening, things are falling apart and a lot of crazy idols appear and all these little gods start to poke through and want to get the attention and want to take it for themselves. But it seems like that it's in some ways like even Christianity. I've said this before, that the death of Christianity seems to be part of how it's going to happen.
I really
and
admire
how it's going
you saying that. Sorry, I really admire you saying that, because it takes guts to say that, especially when I presume there's a lot of Christians here.
Yeah, but I don't mean to stop being a Christian. I just mean to die.
And I'm not saying you are.
I don't like saying that, but what are you going to do?
No. But first of all, I'm trying to afford you a possibility to frame that a little bit more complete, so people can see the positive intent behind the statement. Because there's an analog to what you're saying in the Exodus story. An entire generation has to die.
Yeah.
An entire generation has to die. And Moses can't go in to the promised land. Like the leader and the entire generation. When it was just what Caleb and Joshua, they get to go in?
It's the savior and the dog.
Right.
Because Caleb, one of the ingredients of Caleb is dog.
Right.
And he's actually not an Israelite. He's a Kenizzite. So it's like the inside and the outside, like the inner pillar and the outer pillar, are the ones that create the new world. It's a beautiful image, actually. It's kind of painful to think about.
But there is, and that reminds me. This might strike you as an odd analogy, but it reminds me of Thomas Kuhn in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he talks about when there's a paradigm shift, and one of the primary mechanisms of paradigm shift is the leaders of the previous paradigm die. Mm-hmm. It's human mortality actually is one of the facilitators of a paradigm shift in science. They have to die because you don't derive the new paradigm. It's like your idea of faith is leaping from one level to another. When you shift a paradigm, you can make sense of the previous paradigm retrospectively, but you can't generate it prospectively. And so there's a real death that makes possible a new generation that creates the paradigm shift. Does that?
No, I totally agree. And I think that's the image. I think that when we talk about eschatological imagery, it seems to be the way to formulate it. It's formulated as a crazy image, right? Of a guy sitting on a throne with a sword coming out of his mouth, and he's judging between what is inside and outside, and he's reestablishing the law, and it appears almost mythologically, but we know that it's going to happen because that's how the world works. We know because we experience it at little levels where things die and then they kind of come back up into higher participations. And we also notice, even not just in time, but in the ontological hierarchy itself, how that works, how for things to participate in higher beings, they have to give up some of their idiosyncrasy, right? Like a family meal, like you have to give up your idiosyncrasy to be able to commune with everybody else or a sports team or whatever. And so the mythological image, in some ways, it's like you're formulating the pattern itself, saying this is how the world works. Here's a limit version of it, right? And it has this imagery to it.
But I want to make sure I'm getting, because I think this is a crucial point.
Yeah.
Sorry. So what I'm hearing you saying is, so this imagery is obviously imaginal. It's helping you to become aware of things you're not typically every day aware of. And that awareness is sort of like of the fundamental grammar of reality, which is what you need to drop back to when you're in this space of the wilderness, because that's all that remains, is that sort of fun, is that?
Well, no, that's exactly right, but it gives you a way, because this is the problem, right? It's like, how do you live in the future? How do you orient yourself towards the future? The future's not there.
Yes.
It's just not there yet. You don't know what it's going to look like, but what you have is this image, this eschatological image, and the kind of mythological image of what the future is, and that makes it possible for you to move towards re-enchantment or reappropriation without knowing exactly what that's going to look like in the nitty-gritty details.
Right. So this to me sounds like the way the imaginal is at work in orientation. So I don't know if I can't remember where I've given this. So this is based on a lot of work by Hirschfeld and others. You go into a university where at least the people believe that they're the best in rational thinking and the use of education. And you present them with absolutely clear argument and evidence that they should start saving for their retirement right now. You take all their challenges, you respond to it, they all agree, yes, I should start saving. You come back in 6 months and none of them are saving for the retirement, none of them. And then you do something else. You say, okay, what I want you to do is, well, first of all, let me say what the problem is. The problem is people don't want to connect to their future self. Because their future self is, I mean, I'm facing retirement, so this sort of looms. Your future self is older, uglier, weaker, and unimportant. Right? And so instead, what they did is they said, and notice the language here, I want you to imagine, but this isn't imagine, I want you to imagine your future self as a beloved family member that you've always cared for. And that you have, and you have tremendous compassion and concern for. When they come back in 6 months, the people are saving. If they did and so the variables are, do they do the practice?
Yeah.
If they do the practice, they save. And how vividly they do the practice predicts how much they save, right? This is what I mean about how the imaginal is necessary for the rational, where the rational doesn't mean the inferential, because all the inferences were there in the first experiment. What it means is the ratio, the orienting you and proportioning you properly towards the future. Now, that doesn't mean they're getting an accurate, the point isn't an accurate prediction of their future self. The point is this ratio religio, this properly proportioned orientation. Is that how these
This is what I'm hoping, and some people might not understand why I'm harping up on this, because
I do.
Because I want, and I think to me this is crucially important at this moment, is to be able to formulate a form of eschatology which is not fortune telling.
Yes.
Right, which is not like in so many years this sign is going to happen and this and that and this and that. I'm not saying there aren't signs and there aren't things that happen, but I think that approaching the eschatology this way it can give us a solution, because people hear me, and I know I freak people out, right? I freak people out because I talk about AI and I compare it to the beast in the Revelation, and then people think, oh, Jonathan is saying it's the end of the world. It's like, I'm telling you, this is the imaginal pattern that was projected into an indefinite future, an eschatological future, that distills what civilization and technology is. And now I can use that as a model, and I can look into the world and I can see instantiations approaching or moving away from that model.
So isn't it like a lens that allows you to see better to the horizon rather than a model that you're looking at even?
No, it's like, it's a frame of, it's like a frame of vision that now permits you then to look at the details of the world and to be able to make sense of what's going on. So to me, when I say that, I really do believe that, let's say, AI is moving towards the image of the beast in Revelation. And it's not just like how can I say this? It's not just like an arbitrary description of something that I read in the text that I can see, oh, it's this. Like, oh, you put a number, right? When you were young, you probably had this thing, like, they're going to put a number on your hand. And then as soon as someone talks about tattoos, you're like, oh, that's going to be it. Like, they're going to put a number on your hand. But it's like, it's rather to understand the imagery as something which is manifesting the extreme limit of certain aspects of reality. And then they can kind of come back and they can help us understand. But the reason also why I'm talking about this is because that's what we, at least in the Orthodox Church, that's the way it's set up. So when you look at an image of Jesus in an icon, you're looking at the eschatological Jesus. Even an icon, a normal icon of Christ, when you see him with the book and his hand, that's Christ returning. That's the actual typology that you have. So you're looking at the future when you're looking at an icon of Christ. Like you're looking at the future, the eschatological future piercing in.
But not predictively. That's
no, not exactly, not predictively. It's typological. It's an image. It's man. It's the divine man. It's all that. And in some ways, that's what's drawing us further, like drawing us into itself.
So the thing about predictive is it gives you cognitive closure. That's why we seek it in science. And what you're talking about, this imaginal orientation, this eschatological, is it's orienting to you to the future, but it's leaving space for real emergence, for real uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
Because no one knows the hour when. And,
yeah.
Right?
And there's the example is, right, everybody who's a Christian knows the prophecy, Elijah will come before the Messiah. Yeah, that's a beautiful typological understanding. You understand what Elijah did. He kind of, what his function was, how he kind of mocked the foreign gods. He cleared the room. Jezebel died. Like, that's okay. All that's going on. And then Christ says, Elijah is John the Baptist. All right. Is anybody willing for that kind of interpretation today? Like, are a lot of people capable of doing that now, where it's saying the same thing, now looking at the imagery that is presented, for example, in Revelation, and just say, oh, here's an instantiation of that. Like, this is the Elijah, right? This is the thing. It's not like I said, it's not a map in the gross sense. It's a map in the sense of a frame of seeing.
Yes. So here, I want to do two things. I'll try to do both as quickly as possible. One is I want to give back to you how radical your proposal is, which I sometimes do with you. Because...
Does it sound radical to you guys?
I'm going to try and make it more radical.
I don't think so. If you're going to make it more radical.
No. It's not radical in speech.
Yeah, okay.
That's not what I'm... And remember, radical also means to return to the origin point. Mm-hmm. Radical return to the origin point, so you can reorient, right? That's the original meaning. Just published a paper last year integrating recursive relevance realization with predictive processing theory. These are two huge frameworks. There's two meta problems that you have to solve any problem. One is the relevance realization problem. The other is you want to, as much as possible, you want to anticipate rather than react. In fact, you can sort of measure the intelligence of a being by the scope of its abilities to anticipate. And what your brain is it's a massive predicting machine. At many levels of abstraction, predicting the next second, like it's doing all of this in this really complex recursive fashion. I won't get into I like surprises. No, well, you like surprises that are momentary failures of prediction that increase your long-term prediction capability. You don't like absolutely irreversible surprises. Those are horrible. That's terror. Right? You like surprise birthday parties, but if at the surprise birthday parties they pull out knives, then you're afraid. Like, no, I didn't want that surprise.
Not that surprise.
Okay, so I want people to really sink into that, to savor that. I think this is an incredibly plausible understanding, such that, for example, and this comes into the heart of a lot of therapy even, the brain prefers predictable unhappiness over surprising happiness. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the ways in which people get, some of your language perhaps, I think that's one of the ways in which people can get bound into like sin, right? That they can get locked in a kind of unhappiness that they can't let go of because of how it plugs into that. I'm not saying that's the theological meaning. So what I'm trying to get at is to move into a mode in which, because I struggle with this with scientists, to move into a mode of orientation where you are trying to properly orient to the future but not be in the predictive frame. It's radical. It goes to the fundamental guts of how the brain is working. Does that?
Yeah, but I think the reason why I think it's important is because I also want to recapture like the little old lady, like very simple person who says, God will take care of me, right? That little statement.
Okay.
Because that's in that mode. It's like, I actually don't know what's going to happen. Right? I don't know what's going to happen, but I have an orientation, which is to say, or something like, I know that God wants the best of me. And the thing is that might mean that you're going to get dragged in the street and you're going to get killed and like all these horrible things are going to happen to you. But that mode of anticipation is the best mode to stand in order to face whatever horrible thing the future has in front of
Right.
you. And it's not predictive.
That's right.
It's not at all predictive. It's just a stance, which is like all that is given will be taken as the grace of God.
But do you understand what I mean? It's psychologically radical to take that stance, because like I just said.
Yeah, I don't do it. I don't know what to tell you. I wish I did. I wish I did.
Okay.
I know people that do more than I do.
So there's one thing about the stance from the outward orientation and one about the taking up of the stance. One is to not confuse uncertainty with risk. So one of the things we've convinced ourselves is that we can capture all uncertainty. Risk is calculable, unwanted things. Uncertainty is things that can't be calculated. Mm-hmm. And we have tried since the Enlightenment to convince ourselves that we can capture uncertainty with risk calculation. And what's been coming out in the history of physics and science and all kinds of things is you can't translate uncertainty. You can translate some uncertainty into risk, of course you can, right? But there's a lot of uncertainty. If there's real emergence, then there's real uncertainty. So first of all, because one way we try and sneak in is we sort of, people are placing their bets on, right? And that's not this. You're not before the roulette wheel. That's not what's happening, what we're talking about here. I'm really trying to make this as radical as possible. And then on taking it up, I heard three things in you. I heard these three virtues: humility, trust, and hope. I want to start with the one that I have the most difficulty with. And I don't just mean philosophically, I mean personally, which is hope. And first of all, because there's two interpretations of Pandora's box. Mm-hmm. The standard interpretation is you let all the demons out, but there's this thing in the bottom, hope, right? And that oh yes, hope, right? That's sort of the standard. And then there's the Heideggerian interpretation is hope is the heaviest and worst thing in the box.
Yeah.
Right, and when you take up
it
hope,
makes all the others even more painful.
Yes, exactly. It's a burden.
Yeah.
And we all know that there's obviously toxic hope, like the people who stay in abusive relationships too long, right? The people who misplace their hopes in the Führer, right? There are all kinds of toxic versions. So perhaps we could. So I want to talk about all of them: hope and humility and trust. But and I know hope is one of the.
Yeah. But I would say that again, it's the idea of the proper stance again. That is, what do you place your hope in? Right, because if you place your hope in your spouse completely, then you're going to lose, right? If you place your hope in the government, in your school, in whatever, in your friends, if you put all of it there, then it's not going to work. And I think that's why the idea of hoping in God, which sounds like a trite statement, is actually very profound in the proper stance, which is that my hope is turned towards the infinite. It's turned towards that no thing, which is beyond the things. But if I put my hope in this or that leader or this or that, it's going to experience a disappointment, which is important. The disappointment actually, it might be what leads you towards putting your hope in the highest. Yeah. But if you look in the Christian story, people, sorry if there are any like prosperity gospel people here, but it's like in the early saints, they had their hope in Christ, and they were expressing their hope in Christ as people were chopping their head off, like as people were cutting their limbs off and ripping their skin off. It's like, okay, that's crazy. But in a sense, if you're in that situation, that seems to be the best thing. It's like a limit version of it, right? It's like if you were in a situation where someone's ripping your skin off, what would be the best stance to have? And the saints represent it as this, just look as high as possible. And that it doesn't make what's happening okay, but it's the best stance even in the worst situation.
This is good. I'm going to present something to you as a foil.
Am I making it as extreme as possible by talking
should.
about people
You
getting
should.
their
You
skin
should.
ripped off?
You should, because look, no, if we're preparing for an open horizon, moving to extremity is the proper stance, the proper way to comport ourselves to what we're talking about. So
But do you think that idea of hope solves the problem of hope in terms of disillusioned hope, or do you think it could at least?
Well, what I want to do is I want to try and get it clearer by the contrastive foil, and this is appropriate because this actually happened historically. Because there's another response to disappointment, and of course Kierkegaard plays these two responses off against each other: the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation. Right? So there's the Stoic response. Now, the Stoic response is, look, I totally get your disappointment thing, like 100% agree. Right? And so don't place your heart in anything that is ultimately disappointing. And then they say, well, how do we determine, like, in a rational manner, what's disappointing or not? Because sometimes what you think is disappointing may not. You can be confused if you just go off subjective feeling, right? So, and then they say, well, what you do is you try and put your heart, you try to identify with what is good. Because if you are truly in relationship to what is good, you can't ultimately be disappointed. And then they say, well, what is it that's always good? Friendship? No. Friendship can turn bad, and can wealth? No. Fame? And they rule. And then they say, what's the one thing that's always good? And their answer is wisdom. The cultivation of wisdom is always good. There's no situation in which the endeavor to become wiser can turns bad. Wisdom is the good. And then that also allows them, because they also famously faced torture and execution with that. Now, that's a different. Now, I think part of your response is that's grounded in the notion that the logos of wisdom is ultimately oriented towards the logos of being, which gives them, right? So Seneca says, even when you're painted into a corner, you can jump into the sky, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why, at least in the Christian tradition, Christ is called wisdom of God. Like
Yes.
The imagery of wisdom in the Old Testament, there's a duality to it a little bit, but most of the church fathers interpreted that as being the logos.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
So the difference, I would say, between the Stoic and the Christian would be that in the Stoic, it's like it's a virtue in the sense that it's a principle, maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas in Christianity, it's a person that you follow. It's someone that you follow.
So let me see if I can strengthen your argument.
Yeah.
And so part of what I hear you saying, given what we said earlier, and I'm using, that I'm using the term in the sense of icon, right? By saying it's personable, is that there is something that can afford the imaginal engagement that can reach your grandmother.
Yeah, something like that.
Is that fair?
It's something like that, but it's real. It's not a.
I always make a
metaphor.
distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary. The imaginary is not real. Look, if predictive processing is right, most of your perception of this floor is imaginal.
Yeah.
Right? You're imagining it, but it's not illusory because the imaginations are true. Right? Because look, if I want to walk across this floor, the sensory motor loop is too slow. So my top-down processing is actually predicting. I'm imagining most of the floor. That gives me the capacity to walk quickly across. So that's when the imaginal is in the very guts of your contact with reality. That's how I'm using the word. Is that okay?
No, I think that's fine.
So the claim then is that, and I'm understanding this claim better because I've heard you and Paul make it to me several times, and each time it goes round. And I don't mean I'm just playing with this. I hope you don't think that. But I'm getting clear about what the claim here is. Christianity has what Stoicism has about the logos to the logos, and that's what's always good. And you can align your logos to the logos. Maximus even uses that.
He says exactly that.
Yeah. So that's not something for it. But what you're saying is in the form of a person, and not just person, but also hypostasis person, right? Because hypostasis also means substance and principle. It's we've reduced it to our Lockean notion of what a person is. So it's person in this fatter sense. Is that fair too?
Yeah.
Okay. And then that gives you imaginal access to binding your logos to the logos in an even more profound manner.
Or even relational, in the sense that the way that we experience, and this is why, in some ways, when we talk about principalities or agency or transpersonal agency, is that the best way to engage is as if you're engaging with an agency.
Yeah.
Not as if you are.
But it's
careful.
an imaginal
as much
engagement.
as you're an agency, right? As much as that in some ways the mode of human engagement is through agency and through personhood. Like that's actually how we engage. And so the claim is important because there's the reason why there's been so much kind of arrogance about how silly the image of God, the personal God is, and kind of how just trite and ridiculous it is. But I want to propose that when we engage with virtues even, or if we engage with them as models, and even incarnate models to follow, that's the realist. It's realer than just engaging with it as an abstract principle. So it's like it's an incarnational way of thinking. So I follow examples of wisdom.
Yes.
And wisdom itself appears as a type of a agency that I can submit my will to. And so it changes the world back into a world of it changes the world back into more like the ancient world, where you have these agencies which come down on us from heaven and that we can follow. And we don't see them as abstract principles or as forms in the way that Plato saw them, but more, I think, at least myself, more like the way that the pagans saw the gods, rather than the way that Plato sees the forms.
Well, in Neoplatonism, those two get...
That's right. No, I totally agree.
Yeah. So first...
I'm going to get you in trouble again by saying things like that. With the people that are like, Jonathan, the superstitious guy, trying to get John to believe in demons or whatever.
I defended you.
You did an amazing job. Like someone started attacking me, and John has been amazing at defending my position. But I know it's a radical thing, and it's hard for people to get into that space because it's unsettling.
Yeah, but if they don't leave the paradigm they're in to get to that space, they're screwed. That's part of the AI thing. And
I think it is part of the AI thing, definitely.
But I want to stick on this point because there's two things. So first of all, I think I'm hearing you, and there's a way in which I deeply agree that in order to properly orient logos to logos, it can't just be the cognitive grasp of a principle. It has to be internalizing the stage, because you have to be internalizing perspectival taking and identity formation. That's exactly right. And so I think I get that. And please take this as how I'm understanding it, and I'm not drawing equivalencies here, but that's what I'm trying to do in After Socrates, is I'm trying to give people Socrates as a sage that can give them how to internalize perspectives, identity formation, basically, embodies and enacts. Because that's the point of the dialogues. The point of the dialogues is to say, look, there's no definition of wisdom, but here's a person who embodies it. And what the dialogues do is they break you out of trying to come up with a definition in order to, when they work, in order to orient towards, here's an embodiment, and I can do exactly what you're talking about with that. Now, and I'm not, and I don't want to do.
No.
But so I get that, right? And I make it clear in the series repeatedly. I'm not trying to draw equivalencies between Jesus and Socrates, although I think, like in Kierkegaard, putting them into deep dialogue, that's Kierkegaard. I think it's a very valuable thing to do. I think now, so big yes to that part. And
so how can you, comes back to what I said yesterday. How can you do that in a way that is more than just a mental exercise? So the reason why, one of the reasons why I brought up celebration is because that's part of it.
Yes.
Right? So worship and celebration in general is a way to to participate and make these things, it's
Yeah.
like by just attending to them and celebrating them, lifting them up.
Yes.
I'm making them models for me to follow.
Yes.
And with philosophers, that seems difficult. It's difficult to do. Like unless you would organize like a cult of Socrates, which I don't suggest. I'm not suggesting that.
I'm not suggesting that either. Well,
but it seems like that's in some ways that's the to me the true mode of participation engages that. So it's like I celebrate my father, right? It's like we celebrate the 50th wedding anniversary. We're all there together, and we're there, and we're recognizing that as something to put up on the pedestal,
Sure.
and therefore to follow and to engage with. And it's not the same as saying these are the principles of a good marriage. You should follow them.
Yes.
The first one is way more real because it has that, it has exactly all that it needs. It has a kind of liturgical aspect to it where I'm lifting it up and I'm putting it up and I'm saying to everybody, look at this. This is what's valuable. Everybody
Sure.
looks at my parents that they've been married for 50 years and they're like, wow, look at how, that's crazy that they did that. Maybe I could do that. We don't have those mental, it's not as explicit, but that's how it works.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's first of all an answer, but before I answer, can I put my finger on the problem I wanted to pose, because the answer will be engaged with that. So the problem you face with everything, all the good points you just made, this is why I wanted to push on person, is our sort of established sense of person is a creature, is a thing, and therefore, so I'll put aside all the silly, God's a sky wizard. Those people, yeah, I agree. They're by and large sort of idiots because they're comparing the worst form of religion to the best form of science, which is like I can do that with science too. Like here's Edison, and he's an example of science, and look at how crazy and stupid his method is. And let's look at Aquinas and how systematic he is. See, religion is so much better than science. It's a ridiculous. So I agree with putting all of that aside. But I do think there is a point, and I think the Tillich makes this clear. The concern with idolatry is ultimately the concern with not relating to the ground of being as a being, right? And so that's the problem with the imaginal is it focuses you on a being, right? And yet, and I know Eastern Orthodoxy really wrestled with this, the icon versus the idol, and Jean-Luc Marion is right. But you see, there's a tension there, right? There's a tension also with focusing on. Do you see that?
No, unless this is now I'm going to be very, very explicitly Christian, but if the being appears as someone who dies, and then that being appears as someone who says something like, not me but the Father, right?
Sure.
And so the point, because you don't have a choice, right? That's the problem. You do have to see, or you do have to imagine, but if you do that, and then that's what you have, right? You have an image of a man on a cross who's dying, and he's doing it to fulfill the will of the Father. And so what he's doing is showing how it is a no thing. When it appears as a thing, it appears as an emptying. When it appears as a kind of emptying of itself into the world. And so it helps, it gives you that place of focus. You've got it, but you know that it's not, how can I say that it is that emptying, and that it only exists in the vertical relationship.
Okay, now I can answer your question to me then, right? Because for me, I'm not proposing a cult of Socrates, because Socrates empties himself completely, knowing that he does not know. Yeah. And then what he does is he is a way of imaginally orienting to the good or the one. And that's the Neoplatonic interpretation of Socrates. And that's how I internalize Socrates as a sage. I'm not trying to build a cult around Socrates.
And so then, let's say the practices around Socrates, like the Lectio Divina, I imagine.
Yeah, Lectio Divina, for very much. Philosophical contemplation. But it's Socrates broadly construed. It's Socrates as the exemplar of philosophia as the cultivation, the love, the philia, the shared love of wisdom, which is always good.
Yeah, well, I mean, it definitely shows the like that's the difference, I guess. Like that's the big divide is that in some ways, I think that we do need a cult.
Yes.
Like we actually need it. Like without it, like without the cult, we just it's not enough to hold all the levels together. Because what a cult does, sorry, you're asking me to be radical. Like, okay, so what the cult does is that because it frames it with imaginal language, it makes it accessible to everybody, right? So it's like the most uneducated person can look at a crucifix,
Yeah.
and the genius in the university can look at the same image, and they're both engaging with it at their appropriate level of understanding and of participation, but it offers that possibility, right?
Yes.
To all come together, and so the little lady can have a cross in their house, and
So
it's totally fine.
And you and Paul make this argument, and you know that I take your arguments seriously and take them to heart. I guess there's a little bit of pushback.
Yeah, you should, because I just had a bunch of crazy stuff. It's like I just imagine all the comments. Jonathan says it has to be a cult.
So first of all, like I said yesterday, I think the accusation of a cult is just empty. I think if you recenter cult in cultivation and the cultivating of a sense of the sacred, then I agree. But these practices that I'm talking about do that. But I want to be. The accessibility scaling problem is a real. I mean, I've been responding to this since the very first you made it.
That's right.
And again, I'm asking for a little bit of charity to not do the apple and oranges.
Yeah.
Christianity didn't land that scaling.
No.
It took centuries.
Yeah.
Right. It took centuries. Right. And so it's like I'm not in the place to make the comparison with like it's a little. I'm saying it's a little bit unfair to what I'm talking about in some ways, right? It's like I don't know, and I'm certainly not trying to found a religion, and I keep saying that, but I think we're making progress in scaling this more and more. I think there's reason to believe that's the case, and it's certainly not centered on me because I have deliberately made that the case because it's
No, I don't think I see any of that. Like,
right.
I hope you're not thinking that suggesting that. I don't see any of that. It's mostly I'm looking. I'm trying to. Let's say, I want you to, because I feel like the way that I'm presenting it. I think that's the way I think, and so I want you to.
There's lots of
push
resonance.
me. Like I want you to break what I'm saying. So even like if you, I'm hoping you can even like poke holes in this idea that in some ways worship is necessary for this.
Yeah.
Thing to
So
function.
that's the primary proposition, and so what I'm trying to get at is because I mean. You've got the practices, Tillich. You've got ultimate concern for what's ultimate, and they're very much about communing, not just communicating. They're very much about the sensing of the leap to the higher level. They're very much about a sense of of radical religio, connecting grammar to grammar. I've been making that argument and. Some of the talk. So there's definitely awe and sacredness, and there's definitely celebration. People are sharing about how. So I feel like, and then there's the scalability issue. I get that, and I've tried to respond to that. I feel like there's something else you're trying to put your finger on in worship that I'm not getting, and that's where you're making your. And I mean this as a friend. That's where you're making your stand, and I want to get clear on that.
No, that's definitely. I think in some ways that's where. In the sense that I do see the worship part as being crucial to how things hold together.
Yeah.
Right, and I see that not just worship, like true worship, let's say to God, but I see celebration. I use the word celebration. That when you do something, when you're moving towards a goal, you're necessarily, to some extent, celebrating the thing that you're moving towards. right? You're elevating it above other possible things you're
It's
doing.
aspirational.
Yeah,
Steep,
there you go. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. And so at a micro scale, you know, let's say you're just how can I say this? You're just walking towards the door. Well, that is a little ritual that is recognizing something as good and is lifting it up above all the other things you could do and is moving towards it, right? So it's a little form of celebration. But then the idea is that in order for that to bind more, it has to
go higher.
Obviously.
Right. But I was trying to, so going to the door is relevance realization.
Yeah.
Right? And then I was trying to say, but you get to a place where relevance realization realizes that it's irrelevant in order to give you the proper stance towards ultimate, and it has to give itself up. Mm-hmm. Now that sounds to me like a radical prioritization, a radical lifting up of the no-thingness, of ultimate reality, of the inexhaustible. Like, wouldn't that?
No, I totally agree. But I think that's the stance that is something like that stance, to stand in front of the no-thingness, to stand in front of the infinite, and to just, that's all you do, really. There's nothing else you can do except not see it, or just make a gesture towards it.
Nicholas Akuza is like, as soon as you try and grab it, you fall into paradoxes, and the paradoxes then just freeze your mind, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I totally get that.
We might be just turning around in circles at this point. It's possible. Because, I mean, I think that definitely, like, every time we talk about this, we push each other further. Like, and then I think we reach the point where we might have to think about it more on our own and keep going. But to me, it's like, okay, so let me just bring it back to the idea of the problem of the meaning crisis and the problem of the home, let's say, the idea of the spiritual home. Is that, okay, we come back to this idea of that the thing that we celebrate in some ways has to be our origin, and in some ways has to be our telos. And that we don't totally pick that.
No.
Like, we don't get to decide what that is completely. It's revealed to us. Yeah. You know, and even for people that have conversion experiences, they usually don't, it's not like they decided to believe something, right? It's something that reveals itself. It's this thing that revealed itself to us. And I think that is, again, that is my worry of any project now that tries to, like, build something.
Yes.
Right? To create this new thing. And it's fine to do that as long as it's all the intermediary things. Right? So, like, for example, you know, I think estuary is great, and I think that's wonderful. But if I heard estuary trying to replace, let's say, the church.
I don't want to replace.
No, not you, not you, but I'm using. Then I'm looking at you. then I would be like, I don't think you don't have what it takes to do that. And so, somebody applaud. That's John Van Donk is applauding. And so I'm worried about all of that. Like we talked about certain people that, because there's a lot of that going on. Like
there is.
Yeah.
And I'm deeply opposed to that too. And I don't want to replace the church. I don't want to replace the mosque. I don't want to replace the synagogue. So there's a couple things here. One is, I think you might be right about the death and resurrection of Christianity, and I think I'm still very open to what that might be, and I try to keep open. That's why I keep in discussion with you. So I want to give you that. But a lot of people see the dying, and that's all they see in profound ways, and then that's mixed up with some very bad history, and Christianity is not available to them for that reason. And could we nevertheless help those people? And there's two possible responses. One is a nasty response, is no, damn them to hell. Or the other is, well, no, they still should be helped. And however that turns out, hopefully what is true and good and beautiful will be at work in that. St. Paul talks about capturing every good thought. Yeah. Right? So the second thing is, part of what I think is going on, and I hear this more in explicated by Paul is, well, Christianity has this huge history, and that means it's been put through lots of trials, and therefore it's more trustworthy in a lot of ways. I think that's a very legitimate argument. The problem is that argument would undermine you adopting Christianity at its origin point. So there's a problem with that argument. It gets you very close to performative contradiction, because Christianity was premised on the fact, no, we can break from, right, the tradition and something.
Because I'm Orthodox, I don't think that.
Well, see, but that's problematic. But
that
that's the other problem for me. And you don't have this problem, and that's fine. But I see the claim that the Christian reads the Jewish scriptures better than the Jewish people. Very problematic, as most Jews do. So
and as most Christians find the Islamic claim on.
Exactly.
That's a legitimate concern.
Yes. So that's how I would respond to that point. So I think we've pushed hope very deeply, and I think we've touched on trust quite well, because trust is an interesting one for me, but I think you've given me a lot to think about. But I think one thing that was still sort of has been left implicit is like this virtue of humility. And so for us, I mean the culture, humility is very hard to inventio or reinventio, because, well, think about the process, humiliation. That's not a positive word. That's a word of devastation and destruction and loss, right? So what is it we need to do to rehabilitate humility?
Well, I think that we have an opportunity. It's annoying because it's a very pressing opportunity. Is that we have a tendency today to self-name for people who want to auto-originate.
Yes.
And when we see that, we notice what it does. It creates a very strange instability when people try to self-name. And you could imagine that the image of self-naming in the Bible, the idea of taking the apple for ourselves, or especially Babel, right? The idea we will make for ourselves a name, we'll reach heaven and make for ourselves a name. That doesn't work because of just the levels, how reality works. Like you said, for you to be able to quantify anything, the name already has to be given.
Yes.
For you to be able to calculate anything, the identity has to be already there.
Yes.
Right? And so that's the scale, like that's this relationship. And so if you understand that, then humility is just the proper stance before life, which is that I cannot will myself into existence. I have to receive from heaven, or receive from above, or receive from the past, receive from tradition, receive from that which was that is not me, who I am. And without that, I can't. I'll just fragment and collapse and start to break apart.
That's really good. So first of all, part of what I'm hearing is humility is an appropriately apprehensive appreciation of the vertical.
Yeah.
So, right? Something like that, an appropriate apprehension of the vertical. So you understand that much is being given. And it could also be this way too, right? What is, like, how the earth gives and right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea that body comes from
right.
outside.
So I think that's very, very powerful. Two things. Humility seems to also have within it a recognition of one's faults, failures, and finitude. That's the opposite of hubris. So how that gets in. And then thirdly, how do we not crush the fact that there is an aspect, and this is the existentialists made a big deal of this, and some of them were Christians, right? That there's a big aspect of us that is self-defining, self-interpreting. A part of being Jonathan is the way in which you have, right, defined yourself, and that's one of the ways in which we're reliably different from other organisms on the planet, right? So first of all, how does the recognition, I'll just use finitude how does that fit into that? And then how do we not crush that part of us that is appropriately understood as our capacity for self-definition?
So I would say the first one, in terms of in terms of being humble and recognizing your faults and all that, one of the problems, the reason why that has been so diseased in the past few centuries is, I think, precisely because we don't think that. Someone who really thinks they're wretched usually doesn't have a problem. The problem is usually people who think they're wretched but really think they're not.
Yeah.
And so they have this perception of their wretchedness, but they think they should be something else. So because of that, they experience it as a kind of oppression and a kind of bitterness.
Oh, so there's
But if you read the great fathers, like this sense of being empty, you know, and of seeing your faults. If you don't think you have much, then all your faults just become opportunities for you to get better. Like that's all they are. They're just opportunities. All your sins become opportunities. All your faults become opportunities. And again, I'm not doing that, just so you know. Sometimes, but not most of the time. But I can kind of see that, and I think that even the whole idea of self-esteem that the modern West has developed.
Self-esteem has been a failure.
Yeah.
I mean, no, seriously. The empirical data is self-esteem has been a failure. Okay, like if either we say it's a rational scientific project and we make predictions and then we get the disconfirming evidence, or we're playing some game. And of course, the culture, to a large degree, is playing some game, right? And I agree. Put that aside. But if you look at the data, self-esteem has been a mistake.
So, but then the idea of the self-naming or the actualization, I think that can be experienced as self-transcendence.
Yes.
Right? But it's not self-transcendence in the sense of just picking yourself up by your bootstraps and lifting yourself up. It's very much like the idea of following a leader, right? So something appears to you as bright and as beautiful and powerful, and it pulls you, right? It kind of gives you that oomph to move into it. So you obviously participate in that, but you don't have it in you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like there are things that are guiding you and pulling you. Whether it's you're playing sport and there are sports players before you that are superstars, and those examples are kind of moving you forward and are aspirational. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is, and I'm going to bring in the Platonic thing about, the appropriate aspirational appreciation of the vertical that is properly binding together the finitude and the transcendent. Mm-hmm. How's that for humility?
Yeah.
Do you like that?
I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah. I think humility, but it's good that you bring up humility, because it's true that it's something that most people think is horrible. We have a sense that humble people are weak. But there are interesting stories of humility that show the strength of humility. And Saint Francis of Assisi is a great example.
Yes.
But there are many examples where he humbles himself in a way that actually is almost secretly raising himself above everybody else. He's not doing it, but it's happening.
Yeah.
By the fact that he's lowering himself and he's shaming everyone around him to a point where everybody recognizes that he's the master.
So I'm not claiming to do this either, but
yeah.
This is sort of meta. I aspire to being more humble, because for me, I want to more, that what we just talked about, that it's not the poles, it's the polarity, right? That aspiration, appropriately aspirational appreciation. And appreciation means understanding as well as valuing, right? Of the binding of the finite and the transcendent together. I aspire, not just want, who cares about my wants? I aspire to be in the stance, the orientation, so that the love of what is true and good and beautiful can grow in me. Mm-hmm. And for me, that is how I try to practice the aspiration towards humility. Does that land for you?
Yeah. No, I think that's great, and I think and I agree. I think that you do sometimes appear that's why some people think you're kind of Christian-like, because you, because
I
you,
can have Christianity, or I can have
Christian
Christian
light.
light.
you can choose. But no, but that the fact that you seem to have taken up humility and agape and the virtues that Christian recognize as being that which leads towards the good, and because you often embody them, people see you and are
So, I mean,
are taken by your stance in life.
so
Yeah, don't you agree? Some of you, yeah.
the Socrates is not my only sage. I have, like I say, I have a symphony of sages, and given what you just did, I hope you'll hear this in the right way. Jesus is also one of my sages, and he will always be that. And I've wrestled with that, and I've come to, for me at least now, a place of peace around that. So if you're seeing that, I hope this isn't disrespectful. Some of the credit goes to Jesus. For me, some of the credit also goes to Siddhartha and to Socrates, but yes, I always like to give credit where credit is due. And so, yeah. I value that. I mean, I've had a tortured relationship, at least early on, and you did too to some degree, with Christianity. And I have criticisms of it, and I've voiced some of them. But I always, at least imaginally for me, like Jesus is alive in me in that way. I don't consider myself a Christian because I think there's because I don't want to water down I have respect for Christianity, I don't want to water it down, right? I don't want to. You have specific claims about history and I right? But I just want to give credit. I was brought up, and then, and I've returned in some ways to, I hope, a right relationship within myself with Christianity through Tillich and through, interacting with a whole bunch of thinkers, David Schindler, who I've now met, and you and Paul. And I hope, I feel that there's been a lot of movement within me so that I can hopefully, I'm invoking hope, I can hopefully at times let that part of me shine through in a way that is valuable to other people.
That's great, yeah.
So how much time do we have left?
I think we should end there.
Yeah,
I
I think we're done.
What do you think?
Thank you.